Waiters, waitresses, what is the worst first date you've witnessed? Story 1. I used to work at a tiny neighborhood restaurant. Everyone that came in was a regular. Most were couples in their 40s to 50s out for a quiet dinner. But there was one standout. A very handsome man in his early 30s would come in. It seems only to break up with women. About twice a month he would come in with a beautiful woman, and partway through their meal, she would cry. I always tried to clean the tables near them for as long as possible, but I only heard a little of his speech. He always tipped well and was super friendly to his coworkers and me. However, seeing him bring in a new lady and knowing what she was about to go through was brutal. Story 2. I worked at a cafe, a small local chain, so there were 2 other locations in the city. So this guy sits down for about an hour and comes up to the counter and asks if we can call around to the different locations to see if the girl was there because they had a date planned, and he was sure that she must have gone to the wrong place. We called the 2 other locations and they said they had never seen anyone fitting that description. The guy stuck around for another couple of hours, buying 2 more drinks and a sandwich, just waiting until we finally closed for the night. I felt so awful for him. He seemed so crushed. Story 3. I work in an Italian restaurant, and a few years ago, I waited on a guy and a girl who met for the first time. Upon arriving at the restaurant, awkward pleasantries were exchanged at the door, and then they were seated. When I was taking their order, the guy asked if we had soup because he had mouth surgery a few days prior, and chewing food was still rough. Unfortunately, we didn't have soup, so I explained that the softest food on the menu was gnocchi. He ordered the house gnocchi and proceeded to cut each tiny dumpling into 4 more pieces and slowly chew each one. He ate the entire dish over 3 hours, and the girl stuck it out for the whole thing. She looked miserable, and they never saw each other again. Story 4. I was working at a Mexican restaurant at the time. I was waiting on a couple, and I could tell it was a first date by the questions I heard them asking each other. Anyway, this Hispanic girl was sweeping next to their table towards the end of their meal, and the woman looks at her, holds out the remains on her plate, and says, "Would you like to take this home to feed your kids?" I stood there in complete shock. This woman spoke no English, but she could tell that this random woman was completely degrading her. The sad thing is, she seemed like she thought she was doing a good deed. Her date looked so embarrassed. Story 5. I work at a Japanese restaurant, and one couple comes to mind. It was the worst for everyone else involved. We offered private rooms with sliding doors, and this couple was hitting it off very well, to the point that after a few drinks, she had moved to his side of the table, and they just went at each other's faces and bodies for about 2 hours. They could have done all that with the doors closed, and it would have been less cringy. Still cringy nonetheless. But nope, the sliding doors were wide open for all the patrons to see. Kids, big groups of people, waitstaff, runners, etc., etc. If I remember correctly, they tipped pretty severely too, so it was not fun. Story 6. I worked at Applebee's. This woman was the worst woman I've ever waited on. She was needy and slurped down her iced tea like there was a worldwide shortage. He was silent. He didn't talk once except to order his quesadilla burger. And she just kept going and going, prating on. And she was mean to talk down how people were losers to be servers and how much better it was working in a shop. In the end, he went to the bathroom and never returned. He jetted to the side door where the toga girls worked and gave them a 20 to give to me. The worst woman was sitting there waiting for him to return. I stood there at the service station waiting for her to realize he wasn't coming back. So after 10 minutes, she started crying, pushing his chair over and flouncing it. I didn't get a tip, but it made my night. Story 7. I was working in a small restaurant with 2 floors. A woman and a man came in, and I had a table for them upstairs. They looked like they had a first date because they'd asked those getting to know each other questions. After ordering food, the woman had to go to the toilet, which was downstairs. As she walked to the stairs, the food arrived. She walked down, tripped, and fell, knocking her head on the ground. 2 colleagues immediately rushed over to see how she was doing. She wasn't conscious and was bleeding from her head, so they called an ambulance. I went to the man while he had already started eating and told him his partner, didn't know how to call her, fell down the stairs, unconscious, and an ambulance was on the way. He walked to the stairs, looked down, and returned to his table to finish his food. Later, the ambulance arrived, and I asked him if he wanted to go with her to the hospital. He said no while completing her food. It was so awkward. He just sat there for another 45 minutes, eating, drinking, and then paid the bill and left. I still don't know what kind of relationship they had and whether the woman was okay. The guy was hoping and waiting for an out to escape the wrong date. It's not a very polite mood to leave your first date hanging while she goes to the hospital. But If he went there with her, the awkwardness probably would have just continued. All the doctors and staff would assume you're the husband or boyfriend and ask about her medical history. And when she wakes up, she probably would be confused because she doesn't have much memory of the guy and wants him to just leave the hospital anyway. At least he ate all the food she ordered, and hopefully she got something delicious. Story 8. This is a story where the somewhat awkward guy was doing pretty good until his boss messed it up. So this couple was on a first date, seated at a table in the back. At first, I didn't think much of it and wasn't even aware that it was a first date until the restaurant's phone rang. A man called to let me know that his son was there on his very first date ever. His son was in his late 20s. This was a big deal to him, and he called the restaurant to make sure that we could do our best to make sure that they had a pleasant evening. My boss heard and instantly went to the kitchen to ensure they received particular treatment. What followed were plates with rose petals, red hearts, etc. Too way over the top when serving the dishes. My boss even mentioned the phone call to finish it off. The dessert came complete with fireworks and all that. The idea was sweet, but this was way too much for a first date between two people who were getting to know each other. As the evening progressed, the girl was visually put off by my boss trying too hard, and the poor guy up until then. Story 9. I work at a country club that is up to its ears in old money that uses said old money to make more new money. The membership fees cost more than a year at my university. To say money is not an issue would be an understatement anyway. I was serving a young couple, and the power imbalance was phenomenal. She was the daughter of one of the board members, and the entire staff knew her father's club account was significant money. And the gent, well, he wasn't a member and certainly looked like he was just the average broke college student. He was wearing plain but nice clothes, and she was dressed to the nines in fashion. The date was going smoothly enough, nothing out of the ordinary until she gets up and leaves the table before I've brought out the bill. I brought the bill to the counter, knowing it was well over $300 worth of food and drinks. All things she insisted on ordering 2 bottles of top-shelf wine. Both finished 2 steaks. When he asked for chicken, she insisted on him eating steak like a man, and he solemnly goes to pull out his wallet and starts tearing up, apologizing that he won't be able to tip. I've never had a customer cry over not being able to tip, and he further explained that he was a server too, and she didn't know he wasn't rich, and she left because he had told her about his scholarship. I was flabbergasted and kindly reminded him that we do not take credit cards or cash at this country club. We only charge 2 accounts, and so her father got the hefty bill. But rest assured, he signed a handsome tip to me in her name because club policy is that the registered guest may sign for their host member. Given that the members had invited them, it was entirely satisfying. The last I heard, her father cut her off, and I couldn't help but smile. All the life lessons she is learning, like working on going on dates. At least this poor guy could escape the date without spending a dime on this stuck-up rich girl. At first, I'm sure he was super nervous about taking on such an expensive bill, but he quickly went from sweating it to a huge sigh of relief. I'm sure the relationship probably never worked out. I would assume, but at least he got some high-class steak and top-shelf wine out of it, and now he has a good when I was back in college story to tell later.